Hi sewing friends, today I'm going to teach you how to sew a conversation heart themed backpack, perfect for Valentine's Day and beyond. You'll need your main fabric and lining, a 9-inch non-separating zipper, double fold extra wide bias tape, fusible interfacing and fusible fleece, the free printed pattern, which you can access by following the link in the description on YouTube or by following the link under the supplies section in my blog post, iron-on, your Cricut machine, and lots of pins or clips. You'll also need 2 sets of 1.5-inch strap adjusters. Print the pattern pieces at 100%, being sure they're not set to scale. You can check the 1-inch test square to make sure it printed at the correct size. Cut along the borders and tape the pages together. Next, cut out all of the fabric, interfacing, and fusible fleece as instructed on the pattern pieces. Transfer any markings on the pattern pieces to the right side of the main fabric pieces with a disappearing ink pen or chalk. I'm not going to make you watch me cut every single piece, but remember to also cut the rectangular pieces as listed under additional pieces to cut on page 2 of the pattern. I didn't want to use the lining fabric for the straps on this particular bag, so I cut them out of the main fabric instead. I also added 8 inches to the length of all the strap pieces as I originally made this pattern for toddlers. With the added length, the straps are long enough to fit both my tween and even myself. You can trim up to the width of the seam allowance on the interfacing if you'd like. I usually trim it about half of the seam allowance for easy application on the fabric and to prevent the adhesive getting on my iron and ironing board. On the fusible fleece pieces for the front, back, and gusset, trim the seam allowance. This will help reduce bulk and make the curves easier to sew. You do not need to trim the strap or strap loop fusible fleece pieces as the measurements listed under additional pieces to cut already have the seam allowance removed. Apply the interfacing to the wrong side of the corresponding main and lining fabric pieces. My absolute favorite way to do this is with my Cricut Easy Press. It's a huge time saver when you have a lot of interfacing to fuse. The fusible fleece will go on top of the interfacing on the main fabric pieces with the adhesive side of the fusible fleece attached to the right side of the interfacing. Fuse the front, back, and gusset fusible fleece pieces in place following the manufacturer's instructions. Be sure to use a pressing cloth or press from the right side of the fabric. Before adding the interfacing and fusible fleece to the strap and strap loop pieces, we're going to create some folds on them. Take one strap fabric piece and press in half longwise. Next, open up the fold and press each long edge close to the center fold line and press. Fold the strap along the center line again and press. Open the fold and attach the interfacing adjacent to the center fold on one side. Next, fuse the fusible fleece on top of the interfacing. The fusible fleece should end 1/2 inch before each end of the fabric. I find it easiest to position the fusible fleece on the interfacing, then fold the strap back along the pressed lines before fusing the fleece in place. Repeat the same pressing and fusing steps to add the interfacing and fusible fleece to the other strap. Open one end of each strap piece and press it 1/2 inch toward the wrong side. Then fold it back in quarters and press in place again. Repeat the same pressing and fusing steps to add the interfacing and fusible fleece to the strap loop pieces, with the exception of that 1/2 inch pressed edge on one end. The pressed edges should be along the 5-inch length of the pieces so that it will be approximately 1.5 inches in width when pressed into quarters. If you're ready to attach the interfacing and the pieces are too long, you may have pressed the fabric in the wrong direction, so be sure to double check that. You should have the front and back pieces out of the main fabric with interfacing and fusible fleece, the gusset main fabric with interfacing and fusible fleece, the straps and strap loops with fusible fleece, the zipper tabs with interfacing, the strap cover with interfacing, the lining front and back pieces with interfacing, and the lining gusset with interfacing. It's time to start sewing. Stitch close to the edge along each side of each strap and strap loops, also stitching along the short pressed edge on the straps. You don't need to stitch along one end of the strap loop pieces, but you can if you'd like to for the sake of ease and continuous stitching. Fold each strap loop in half and through the adjuster rings, pinning the raw edges together. Stitch the raw ends together 1/4 inch from the edge. Press each long edge of the strap cover piece 1/2 inch toward the wrong side. Place the top of the strap cover along the line marked and pin in place. Stitch close to the bottom folded edge to attach the strap cover in place. Slide the strap loops under the top folded edge of the strap cover and pin it in place at the markings. Depending on the bulkiness of your strap loop pieces, you may want to have only 1/2 inch under the strap cover to avoid the fusible fleece. Stitch close to the top edge of the strap cover, securing the strap loops in place. It's helpful to backstitch at each edge of each loop for added strength. Next, thread the stitched end of one strap through the middle bar of a strap adjuster with the right side of the strap adjuster facing upward. Overlap the end 1.5 inches back onto the strap and pin it in place. Stitch the strap end in place with 2 rows 1/4 inch apart. Repeat with the other strap. Take one strap and thread the free end through the adjuster loop, then back up through each side of the adjuster bar. Pin the end of the strap to the top of the heart curve as marked, angling the outside of the strap about 1/3 inch above the fabric to help the strap sit at a slight angle when worn. Repeat with the other strap. Stitch the pinned ends in place 1/4 inch from the edge. Trim the edges of the straps and strap cover that extend past the heart shape. Next, we're going to sew the zipper in front of the heart backpack. Press one short edge of each zipper tab 1/2 inch toward the wrong side. Right sides together, open one pressed zipper tab end and place the pressed edge adjacent to the zipper bottom stop. Pin it in place. The short side of the tab will be toward the end of the zipper. Repeat with the other zipper tab at the opposite end of the zipper. Stitch along the fold line on each end, securing the zipper tabs to the zipper. The stitches should be as close as possible to the top and bottom stops of the zipper without stitching over them. With the main fabric front top piece facing upward, place the zipper right side down along the straight edge. Place the lining front top piece on top with the right side facing down, sandwiching the zipper between the main fabric and lining pieces. Pin the three together, matching the straight edges with the edge of the zipper tape and zipper tabs. Stitch along the pinned edge 1/4 inch from the raw edges. When stitching near the zipper pull, it's helpful to stop stitching and with the needle into the fabric, lift the presser foot and slide the zipper pull out of the way. After stitching past that area, the zipper pull can be pulled back out of the way again. Turn everything wrong sides together and press flat along the seam. Repeat the same steps to attach the bottom edge of the zipper tape to the front bottom main fabric and lining. Stitch the front main fabric and lining together around the entire outer edge 3/8 inch from the raw edges. For a fun twist on this particular backpack, I wanted to make it into a conversation heart for Valentine's Day. If you'd like to do the same, now's the time to cut your design using your Cricut machine and iron-on. I used my Cricut Joy Extra and added the words "Be Mine" in red, and will link to the Cricut Design Space project in my blog post or YouTube description if you'd like to use it also. After cutting the iron-on, weed it and fuse it to the front piece about 1 inch below the zipper. Once it's cooled, you can peel the plastic sheet and continue on with the next sewing steps. Next, we're going to create the gusset, which is what will give the backpack its depth. Right sides together, pin and stitch the short edges of the main fabric gusset piece, starting and stopping 1/4 inch from each end, and using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Press the seam allowance open. Fold the gusset in half at the seam and make small 1/4 inch perpendicular snips in the raw edge on each side at the opposite folded end to mark the halfway points. The next steps are where it can get a little trickier if you haven't sewn a lot with bulky fabrics or curves, but take your time, follow my instructions, and you'll do great. Right sides together, pin the gusset seam to the bottom point on the back piece. Pin the snip marks on the gusset to the center top of the back. Continue pinning from the bottom point upward about 1/3 to half of the way up, stopping where the curve begins to deepen. Repeat on the other side. At this point, we're going to make 1/4 inch perpendicular snips every 1/2 to 5/8 inches along the unpinned edge of the gusset. The gusset and front and back pieces match up along the seam lines, but this means the raw edges would not match up if we were to pin them together along the raw edges without snipping the edges to help ease them around the curves. Pin the clipped edges to the upper curves of the back. This is a time where you really can't use too many pins or clips, and this extra effort now will make it easier to sew and help have nice smooth curves in the finished bag without any unwanted tucks in the fabric. Next, use a 1/2 inch seam allowance to stitch along the pinned edges, attaching the gusset to the back. I also like to backstitch at the top inward curve on each side for added stability. Really take your time and be patient, and you'll end up with pretty and smooth curves. The next steps will also help the bag's curves look neat and professional. Clip a V-shaped notch into the top inward curve. I also recommend to trim the seam allowances to 1/4 inch to reduce bulk. Another option is to clip notches into the upper curves if you prefer. You can now press the seam allowances open or to one side if that's easier. A pressing ham is helpful if you have one, and I also often take an oven mitt so I can put my hand inside the pieces. But be super careful if you do this, and especially watch out for steam coming out of your iron. Pressing the seam allowance open can be tricky with this shape of bag, so I most often press them to one side. If you do this, just make sure to press the corresponding lining pieces to the opposite direction when we get to that point so that the bulk is evenly distributed. Phew! Now that you've sewn one gusset side to the curves, you know you can do this. Next, attach the lining gusset to the lining back using the same method as we did for the main fabric back and gusset. wrong sides together, place the lining back inside the main fabric back, pinning them together along the free edge of the gussets. Stitch the two pieces together along the pinned edge using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Next, we'll attach the backpack front to the back and gusset. Before we do this, make sure the zipper is open or you won't be able to turn the backpack right side out afterward. Attach the open edge of the gusset to the front piece, right sides together, using the same method we used earlier. Did I mention to make sure the zipper is open? Because it should be. It will be really bulky to stitch through, but using lots of pins and stitching slowly will keep you stitching smoothly. You've already done this twice, so you've got this. Before clipping and trimming the seams, turn the backpack right sides out to make sure there are no unwanted tucks and that the curves are sewn smoothly. If everything looks good, turn the backpack lining side out again and clip and trim the seams. Our last step is to make this last raw exposed edge pretty. We're going to sandwich the raw edge with double fold bias tape. First, notice which side of the bias tape is slightly narrower. We want that side to be facing up when we're sewing it onto the bag, as that will help ensure that the half on the bottom is getting caught in the stitches. I find it easiest to sew the bias tape with the gusset facing upward and the zipper side facing downward. With the backpack wrong side out, begin to sandwich and pin the bias tape around the seam allowance just above the bottom point on one side, with the bias tape just covering the stitch line. Continue to pin the bias tape to the seam allowance, stretching it gently around the curves. You can stop at the top if you'd like and start a new end of bias tape, or you can manipulate the bias tape around that point and continue on with the same piece like I did. This is another time where more is more when it comes to pinning. As you're pinning, frequently check the back side of the bias tape to make sure it's covering the seam line slightly more than the front side is. Once you're nearing the bottom point, stop pinning and leave enough of a tail of bias tape to cover about 1/2 inch or so of the first end of the bias tape. We'll create a mitered corner when we sew the bias tape to the bottom point. Beginning at the first pin, stitch close to the edge of the inner bias tape fold, frequently checking that you're catching the bottom edge underneath as well. Stitch around the entire pinned edge, stopping at the bottom point where the last pin is. You want to stitch close to the stitch line below the bias tape, but no farther into the bag. Create the mitered corner on the bottom point by folding the bias tape and then stitch the last small section of the bias tape to the seam allowance, allowing the end of the bias tape to slightly cover the first end. Press the seam allowance to one direction from both the bag wrong side out and right side out. I found it especially helpful to use my Easy Press Mini for this part. Whichever way you do it, be careful to not burn yourself while pressing the curves. Pressing it really well will give that extra professional look. Admire your adorable conversation heart backpack. Great job!